Hi there guys, Michael Valenti here with a School of Self-Defense in Indianapolis, coming at you with another concepts video. And today I'm going to be discussing, or rather answering, the question of when should you start sparring. It's something that you'll hear me talk a lot about throughout all of my videos, of the importance of training against somebody who is not being cooperative. And the question is, when is the right time to go ahead and start doing that? And I'm going to kind of answer this in a couple different ways. The first way that I'm going to talk about it is the literal act of getting in there and just getting your feet wet and sparring. And my basic rule of thumb is once you have your defensive maneuvers down to a suitable degree, then you start sparring. So for example, if you are learning how to box, you want to learn how to jab, cross, hook, but you really want to master parrying, shield blocking, and maybe even learning a little bit of head movement before you get in and start boxing with people. If you are learning, for example, judo or jiu-jitsu or wrestling, some sort of grappling art, well, then you're going to need to learn about things like proper break falling and, of course, etiquette like tapping out and things like that so that you can train safely. So the sooner you start sparring, the better, in my opinion. Might as well get there and get it started and get your feet wet, but making sure that you have all the defensive tools you need to spar safely is a must. The other way that I'm going to answer this question is I'm going to talk about when is a school taking too long to have you spar. As far as I'm concerned, sparring should be open every single class. So at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day, there should be always an opportunity for people who are interested in sparring to spar. For example, in my school, every single time I teach, the end of the day, the last, half an hour to an hour of the day, I just open the mat out. I bow everybody out. We wrap up the class. Some people go home, but I always leave the mat open so that anybody who's interested in, getting in there and getting dirty and fighting with each other can do it, because to me, experience is the ultimate teacher. So as much sparring as possible, of course, once again, under good supervision and having really good, safe sparring practices. I have, on the flip side, I know of a local martial arts school that teaches self-defense, and apparently you're not even allowed to come to for starters, they have a sparring class, so they only have one class in which sparring is even allowed, so they don't ever have like an open mat for people to just come practice. But you're only allowed in their sparring class once you've already achieved a couple belts in their system. So someone very well may train with them for a year and a half, and never spar. And now, in my opinion, that's way too long of a time to go without trying to test your techniques against an unwilling opponent. I think it's really important, even though your first 6 months of sparring is probably just going to be you getting beaten up, I much prefer you to get that part out of the way here in class with me so I can supervise you and make sure everybody stays safe than for it to randomly be, in the quote-unquote street. To me, taking a year or two to start sparring is ridiculous. Another example of not sparring enough, for example, is there was a school that when I was a younger man in Mississippi, there was a school that only sparred once a month. They had a 1 hour or 2 hour sparring day once a month. And once again, that's not enough. It's better than nothing. So if you're at a martial arts school and there's actually no sparring, as far as I'm concerned, you're not actually learning how to defend yourself. So, GTFO, it's not where you want to be. So the last thing that I'm going to kind of address in the question of sparring is, when do I spar a technique? So one of my instructors, Dan Anasanto, who I've been doing multiple seminars with for 5 or 6 years at this point, something he says is that all techniques should go through 3 phases, where you do them cooperatively, contested, and then combative. So the idea is you learn a new throw, and first thing you want to do, you want your partner just to let you throw them until you get the throw down. That's the cooperative. Then you have contested, and that's where I try to throw you, but maybe you resisted a little bit, or you give me a little bit of a hard time, but we aren't fighting yet. And then you have combative, which is where you don't know I'm going to throw you. That we have slapped hands, we're sparring, and I'm going to try to get that throw, or punch, or trap, or whatever maneuver it may be. And so when it comes to sparring a technique, that's exactly how it should be done, is that you don't want to learn a technique in one class and then immediately try that technique out in sparring. Ideally, you're going to spend some time kind of honing in the actual technique itself and then take it into the combative arena. So far what we kind of looked at here is the idea that you really should be sparring as soon as you have your defenses up. So once you're good at falls, once you're good at blocks, then you should be sparring. We looked at what not sparring enough looks like. So either taking years to start sparring or only sparring once a month or something like that. And then we looked at sparring an individual technique. The last thing I want to address is how sparring relates to self-defense. And this is really interesting to me because I've met people, for example, like in Krav Maga circles, that will say something along the lines of, well, sparring isn't what self-defense looks like, so therefore we shouldn't spar. And that's the most absurd thing I've ever heard in my entire life. You are correct that a self-defense situation looks nothing like a kickboxing match, but you are really going to have a hard-pressed time developing distance management, developing punch protection, developing any kind of power behind your hits, learning any kind of control, learning positioning, learning your own physical range, unless you're actually sparring with somebody. There is so much important information that comes from just getting in there, putting on some gloves, and sparring with your partner that really gets neglected if you aren't sparring. You just aren't learning this stuff about you. And I've seen it. I've seen people who come from schools that don't spar. And, I'll give you kind of a story. Back when I was in Mississippi, there was a guy who went to a martial arts school. I won't name the style because I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. But his school didn't spar. It was a very joint lock heavy art. So it did a lot of like wrist locks and shoulder locks and even finger locks and things. And so they didn't spar because they said their techniques were too dangerous to spar. Just, too damn dangerous to spar. But we were all part of a group called the Armory, which was basically a weekly fight club thing where everybody would come together and would just beat the crap out of each other until, I guess, nobody wanted to do it anymore. But beside that, he came to one of these and went up against one of our street fighters. So the guy who he was going against had zero experience. The martial artist was a third-degree black belt in his art. He had been studying it for something like 6 or 7 years, but there was no sparring. And he really didn't stand a chance. The street fighter, who had no martial arts training but would just come and fight, beat the crap out of this guy who, was a black belt in that art. And he was very good at the art. He was very good at least he visually looked good when he did it. But he was unable to apply the techniques against an unwilling opponent because he had never sparred. And that's the risk of it. So as long as people are keeping it playful, as long as people are working with each other, trying to keep each other safe, I think sparring is something you can jump into as soon as you know how to block, as soon as you know how to fall properly, and just make sure that you have a sparring partner that's working well with you. I might make another video in the future, if you guys want, about what is good sparring, what is bad sparring. If you guys would like to hear more about this subject, let me know down below in the, whatever it's called, where you guys talk to me. Also, if you guys have any questions for me, be sure to put them down there as well. If you live in the Indianapolis area and you would like to come train with me in any of the arts that we study, all the information is on our website, theschoolofselfdefense.com. Until next time, I'm Michael Valenti with the School of Self-Defense. Fight on.